Hi everybody, thanks for coming back and listening to podcasts on our YouTube channel. So I think these are great, these podcasts, aren't they? Because you can listen to them when you're out running or walking or driving along in the car. Brilliant, and a great way of sharing the passion and the love and information. So let's talk about the Auxiliary Air Force and 607 County of Durham Squadron. Not a squadron you hear too much about, really. Hurricane Squadron in the Battle of France and the Battle of Britain. And I'm particularly interested in the recollections of an old friend, Harry Welford, who joined the squadron before the war, 1938, and wrote me reams of letters, which I published in Letters from the Few, which Pen and Sword produced in 220, which was all based on correspondence with the Few. And looking back at these things, it's extraordinary, the detail that we were able to go in. Now, I find the first-hand accounts fascinating, and you get so much more from these than you do from the official records and things like combat reports at the time, which are written in a very largely, not always, largely very matter-of-fact way. Well, they had to be, didn't they? But, you know, Harry was a great chap. And even he says, I mean, when we're talking about events that happened a long time ago, I used to be a police detective, and I would liken producing a highly detailed account of the Battle of Britain, returning to primary sources, evidence, always got to be evidence, is a bit like trying to unscrabble and make sense of the worst violent disorder ever. But the trouble is, it's moving at 350 miles an hour, 30,000 feet above the ground. So, you know, it's all difficult, isn't it? And for people to try and remember it with clarity, you know, the facts of what happened to them 40 odd years ago is extraordinary and very difficult. So you do have to temper these first-hand accounts with research to actually corroborate or cross-reference the facts or point out what might not be fact. And in fact, 25th of June 1988, Harry wrote to me and he said, "It's now 48 years since the Battle of Britain, and not only are our recollections somewhat dimmed, but there is a tendency to dramatise, perhaps even fantasise, and it's a shock to be told what the records say." And he was talking about a specific thing that I pointed out about a Polish pilot who he flew with and that he was previously unaware of. But then we really developed our correspondence, and the auxiliary squadrons, I mean, they were the social elite, weren't they? Wealthy young men who, many of whom owned their own airplanes, flew for pleasure at the weekend. Part-timers until called up. Harry was called up 24th of August 1939 and then had to complete his service flying training and then go to 6 operational training unit at Sutton Bridge to learn to fly the Hurricane. So he then wrote and said, after 6 hours on the Hurricane, some of us were detailed to stand by to be flown over to France to replace some of the losses which our squadrons were suffering out there, including 607. A Rapide and a Bombay were already on the aerodrome to take us when another signal came through cancelling the flight. This was 6th of June 1940, when the capitulation of the French was about to take place. Anyway, we resumed our training until the 15th of June. I was posted to 607 Squadron, which had returned from France to Usworth, our home station. So he then goes on to say that, and this is an important thing about these auxiliary squadrons, because they were locally raised. The personnel were often friends or even family relations. And when they started suffering casualties, the morale of these squadrons did suffer. 609 West Riding Squadron down at Middle Wallop and Warnwell had a hard time at the beginning of the Battle of Britain, which David Cook documented in his book Spitfire Pilot, and it comes through loud and clear there, you know, the depression that these casualties caused. But he says about this, he said, about 607, I was very happy to be posted back to 607, where we could renew our contacts and relationships with our friends and family, being locally based. The sad thing was the gaps in the ranks of those lost out in France and coming across from Dunkirk. Of the 20 or so pilots that I knew, 6 were killed later. My cousin was shot down over France and captured. Another, Peter Dixon, was shot down near Dunkirk and managed to get to one of the little ships on the troop evacuation run where it received a direct hit and everyone was lost. Later, information is that he was shot down and descended by parachute into the sea. He was picked up and taken to a Dunkirk hospital where he died of his injuries. So all of this really evidences what an uncertain future these young men had. And then he goes on, I had the choice of which flight I should go to and naturally chose A as the flight commander was Francis Blackadder, as he was the friendliest, acting like a Dutch uncle in my earlier days on the squadron. As we were both rugby players, he got me in the Auxiliary Air Force team. Anyhow, that was my choice, but it was a disappointment that my best friend Stuart Parnell went into B flight, because it would mean not only that our squadron activities would be divided, but also our time off. Stuart had flown Gladiators in Norway and was pretty pleased to be back in one piece. He was one of the world's natural gentlemen. He'd had a public school education and I think gone to university, was several years older than me, but despite his extensive experience, never treated us in any way other than equals. One could not have chosen a better companion or friend, either in the service or out. Back at Usworth there were 2 other newcomers to 607 Squadron, namely Bob Lauder and Scotty Lenihan. We all became good friends, though sadly not for long. And then he goes on to talk about that incredible day of the 15th of August 1940 that I've had to forensically deconstruct minute by minute, which is when Luftwaffe 5 attacked northeast England from Norway. And Luftwaffe 5, they came over Heinkel's, escorted by ME 110s beyond the range of the Messerschmitt 109 single-seater, and were met by squadrons from Usworth, Catterick and so on, and it became known as the Junkers Party. The Germans were defeated. Luftwaffe 5 was defeated in a single day. And it's an inspiring scene in the Battle of Britain film of 1969 with Christopher Plummer and so on. It's absolutely brilliant. But it really happened. And in fact, on that day, both sides flew more sorties than on any other day in the battle. And the front that was fought was from right up in the northeast, Sunderland and Driffield, right the way around to St. Evelyn, Cornwall. Now, that's a broad front if ever there was one. So an incredible day. So he says, one Thursday, we were to have a big encounter with the enemy, our first. One considered on a par with the sort of attacks experienced by 11 and 12 groups in the south. It was 15th of August 1940, and at 12:30 hours we were going off duty for 24 hours when the whole squadron was called to readiness. We heard from the group operations room that there was a big flap on. That is a warning of imminent enemy action along the northeast coast. We waited out at dispersal points at flights for half an hour, then scrambled in squadron formation. I was in a feverish state of excitement and quickly took off and climbed up to our operational height of 20,000 feet, ready to patrol the coast. We kept receiving messages over the RT of 40 or 50 plus bogies approaching Newcastle from the north. Although we patrolled for over half an hour, we never saw a thing. Just as I was expecting the order to pancake, I heard the senior flight commander shout, "Tally-ho!" And tally-ho it was. There on our port side at 9,000 feet must have been 120 bombers, all with swastikas and German crosses large as life, having the gross impertinence to cruise down Northumberland and Durham's northeast coast. These were the people who were going to bomb Newcastle and Sunderland and our loved ones, friends and relations who lived there. I'd never seen anything like it. They were in two groups, one of about 70, the other about 40, like two swarms of bees. There was no time to wait, and we took up position and delivered number 3 attacks in sections. As only 3 machines at a time in formation attacked a line of 20 bombers, I just couldn't see how their gunners could miss us. We executed our attack, however, and despite the fact that I thought it was me being hit all over the place, it was their machines that started dropping out of the sky. In my excitement, during the next attack, I only narrowly missed one of our own machines while doing a split-arse breakaway. There couldn't have been more than 2 feet between us. Eventually, spotting most of the enemy aircraft dropping down with only their undercarriages damaged, I chased a Heinkel and filled that poor devil with lead until first one, then the other engine stopped. I then enjoyed the sadistic satisfaction of watching the bomber crash into the sea. With the one I reckon to have damaged during our first attack, these were my first bloods, and so I was naturally as elated as anything. The squadron suffered no losses, but claimed 6 Heinkel 111s and 2 Dornier 17s destroyed, 5 Heinkel 111s and a Dornier 17 probably destroyed, and 4 Heinkel 111s and 1 Dornier 17 damaged, although we know now that in fact there were no Dornier 17s amongst the German formation. And that brings us on to another point. Aircraft identification throughout the Battle of Britain was frequently incorrect. It's understandable, it's all moving at 350 miles an hour, closing speeds of 700 miles an hour. It's difficult, isn't it? And a twin-engined aircraft, well, but those Dornier 17s, they were ME 110s. Anyway, Harry goes on. He says, the attack on Northern England on 15th of August 1940 became known as the Junkers Party, Black Thursday by the Luftwaffe. While certainly the size of this raid was comparable to those being made on southern England, there was one significant difference. Owing to the distance involved, we've covered that, we won't go into that. Right, Harry goes on. I shall always also remember 8th of September 1940 because this was the day after the evening that Betty Elise and I became engaged. But our move to Tangmere in 11 Group was confirmed that day. We were to relieve 43 Squadron, whose CO, Tubby Badger, had been shot down earlier in September, and since which time the squadron had been led by Flight Lieutenant Tom Morgan. Now, barely half the original complement of pilots were capable of operational duties. Of course, it was a tragedy so far as Betty was concerned, but though I felt the same, there was a war to be fought and we were trained fighter pilots. This was the beginning of the end, and as we all climbed into our Hurricanes, having bid our adieus that fine September day, I wondered how many of us would see Usworth or Newcastle again. Strange as it may seem, dirty, smoky old Newcastle was to us seventh heaven when compared with the rolling green fields of southern England. We arrived, however, at a completely blitzed aerodrome where we were greeted by the remnants of 43 Squadron, some on crutches, others with an arm and a sling, and yet another who had his face torn apart by an exploding cannon shell, with a head swathed in bandages. Though they had suffered so many casualties, it was quite amazing to see them walking about. Needless to say, they were very pleased to see us, having just been up on the 3rd sortie that day and were still waiting for news of the latest casualties. We only had time to refuel when we were called out on an operational trip that evening. There was no interception and no casualties. The next morning, to my great disappointment, I was not called upon to fly, and later the squadron went off. In the event, I was the more fortunate, as of 12 Hurricanes, 6 were shot down. And this is a point. The difference between chasing around unescorted, bombers unescorted by ME 109s, and then coming down into the south coast and the southeast, where the presence of 109s changes everything. Peter Brown flew Spitfires with 41 Squadron and 611 Squadron in the Battle of Britain, always used to say the difference was traumatic. That was the word he used, traumatic. That's the difference between flying around up in the north and coming down where the sky is full of the lethal ME 109s, a traumatic change in the tempo of combat. And squadron, time and time again, you look at the casualty list and a new squadron number appears, which is a new squadron that's maybe rested and refitted up in the north and then been posted back for another spell in 11 group or 10 group. And bam, 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 a lot of Hurricanes lost on the same day, because these replacement pilots, many of them had not been in action before. They're lacking in combat experience. And, well, absolutely unbelievable. So, he goes on to say that without time to adjust, this is what I'm talking about, without time to adjust to the new operational conditions, it was inevitable that the lethal 109s would harshly treat the County of Durham Hurricanes. Yet again, this RAF squadron, new to the fray, went on patrol flying the useless Vic formation and paid the price. As ever, the 109s had the advantage of height, sun, and used the excellent Schwarm tactical formation. This divided each staffel into 3 sections of 4 aircraft in line abreast, the aircraft well spread out so there was no fear of collision, enabling the pilots to search the sky for the enemy. In the event of combat, the Schwarm was split into 2 fighting pairs of leader and wingman, the rotor, so the fundamental principles were both flexibility and mutual support. So Harry continues. He says, somehow we just couldn't believe it. No one talked about it, and we all hoped for news to filter through from some remote pub or perhaps a hospital. No news came, so we hardened ourselves to the worst, killed in action. We bit back our tears and our sorrow. It was, you heard about Stuart and Scotty? Rotten luck, wasn't it? Someone would add, and young George, bloody good blokes, all of them. After that epitaph, the matter would be dismissed, with the ordering of another round of drinks to avoid any trace of further sentiment. And in fact, the remains of the South African pilot officer George Drake, who was shot down on that fateful day, or on the 9th of September, they weren't found until recovered by aviation archaeologists in 1972. So, by 17th of September 1940, Harry Welford is 23 years old and he's a veteran. And on that day, B Flight scrambled at 15:05 hours on the squadron's 4th sortie of the day. And Harry's blew 2. 6 Hurricanes patrolling the Biggin Hill Gravesend line at 17,000 feet. The problem with being that there's 2 Gruppen of Me-109s, 60-odd fighters, above the Hurricanes, and B Flight was bounced from above and behind. And this is what Harry remembers of that. When attacked, we were warned to break formation. I broke and took evasive action, as a result of which I lost the squadron. As we had instructions to reform rather than fly alone, I saw a large group of fighters ahead, which I then intended to join up with, until I realised that they were Me-109s. I fired a quick burst at them, but an unseen 109 fired at me and hit my air intake with a cannon shell. I did a quick flick roll that dropped me below cloud. No 109s about, but a lone Hurricane that guarded my tail as I force landed. The engine had seized, and looking down I saw a field in which I thought I could land. As I approached, glycol and smoke streamed from the engine. When I opened the hood, these fumes were sucked through the cockpit and impaired my vision. The field was actually smaller than I thought, but there was a wattle fence that acted like a carrier's arrestor hook. The plane then skidded across the second field, but was brought to an abrupt halt by a tree at the far end, cracking my head on the reflector sight. Blood poured down my face, and thinking that the plane might catch fire, I undid my straps and jumped out, only to fall flat on my face because my leg, which had been wounded by shrapnel, collapsed on me. 2 farm workers rushed over and picked me up, putting me on a section of wattle fence. They told me that there was a German plane in the next field with the pilot in it, very dead. I regret now that I declined their offer to show me, but at the time I felt a bit dicky. In hospital, I gave my report to our flight commander, Flight Lieutenant Jim Bazin, who acknowledged that I had shot down the 109 in the field next to where my Hurricane crashed. Now, however, I am not so sure, as we've not been able to identify a potential candidate from the German crashes that day. Anyway, I was thereafter in hospital for a while with Tubby Badger, 43 Squadron's former CO, who was very brave, always laughing. Sadly, he ultimately succumbed to his wounds, which was a great shame, as he was a fine man. Now, my research into that combat suggests that Harry was actually shot down by Hauptmann Edward Neumann, who was Gruppencommander of 1 JG27, and I corresponded with Edu Neumann, who sent me a copy of his logbook in 1991 confirming that he shot down 2 Hurricanes in this action, the other probably being Sergeant Lansdell, who was killed. And Neumann was a very experienced pilot, having fought in the Spanish Civil War, and later became Commodore of JG27, which he took out to North Africa. And there, one of Neumann's pilots became one of the most incredibly successful fighter pilots of all time, namely Hans Joachim Marseille, the Star of Africa. Now, Neumann's personal victory tally was 13, and he later became Jagdfliegerführer, Jafu, of the German fighter forces in Italy. And as Harry said, a distinguished chap then. Doesn't make me feel so bad about being shot down. So, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And I thought that Edu Neumann was a special character as well, because Marseille had this reputation of being a real maverick that nobody could deal with, and used to go chasing off on his own, was ill-disciplined and a bit of a playboy womanizer, not, that professional, if you like. A bit like the Canadian screwball Björling, and my old friend Air Vice Marshal Johnny Johnson, who was the RAF's official top scoring fighter pilot of the Second World War, and wing leader par excellence, and a real leader, charismatic leader, let's make no mistake. And Johnny used to say to me, Björling, I got rid of him, couldn't do anything with him. But Edu Neumann somehow managed to bring out the best in Marseille, who racked up an enormous score and became a real, iconic German war hero for the propaganda machine. Sadly killed in a flying accident. But there we are. So Harry goes on to say that as a result of his accident, which is what, if you read these RAF casualty files, it's funny really, because you got somebody shot down, and I respectfully beg to report on the accident. And as William Walker said, it wasn't an accident, it was a determined attempt on my life by a German fighter pilot. And Harry feels the same. He said, as a result of my accident, brackets shot down, I lost my operational flying category and went into training command as an instructor. I got married and did 3 years until I was acting squadron leader instructor, by which time I volunteered for operations again. I lost my rank confirmation and after retraining got posted as flight lieutenant to 220 Squadron on Spitfires and Tempests in Belgium, Holland and Germany until the end of the war in Europe. I was posted to India, but as my demobilisation character was due, it was sadly cancelled, though by then, after 6 years of war, we were heartily sick of it. I did try to get a permanent commission, but was turned down. So Harry then became an engineer and settled in Sidmouth, Devon, from where he used to travel around the country to my various events, and died at home on the 6th of October 1996, which was a pity because he was looking forward to the launch of my Bardi's Tanmere Spitfires at Worcester Guildhall, which was a really big event a few days later. But the amazing thing is that with what I've just read to you, which is out of Letters from the Few and quoted directly from our correspondence, this is such an important record now of people's experiences and perceptions. And one thing I would say is Harry is slightly unusual in a way because he's been quite open and honest there about shooting down this German bomber and the euphoria of seeing it crash into the sea. Whereas a lot of the others, they would kind of edge round that. Be very happy to talk about being shot down themselves, very happy to talk about what brilliant fighter pilots their mates were, but would never, God forbid, shoot a line. And I'll give you an example of that. Tim Elkington, who was the last of the few I knew, who sadly left us in 2018. Absolutely brilliant bloke. So modest, such a nice, kind man. And the Elkingtons, lovely family too. And I used to go and see them over at Little Rissington in Gloucestershire. And the one day we were having Sunday lunch at Tim's, and I was talking about staying at Bell 2 Lighthouse, which is an upmarket, unique B&B experience down at Beachy Head in a former lighthouse. Absolutely brilliant, highly recommended. And he said, I remember, we were on patrol, one squadron, this is at Northolt and Tangmere. He said, patrolling over Beachy Head and coming back, it was a hot day, quite low, got the hood of the Hurricane open, and you could smell the wood smoke coming up from the fields below where the farmers are burning the stubble. And I thought, that's England, that smell. And that's worth fighting for. And I thought that was a fantastic quote, which I wish I'd had when I did Tim's chapter in The Final Few, which was published by Amberley in 2015. And I put a thing on Facebook, well, just come back from Tim Elkington's, absolutely brilliant. A picture of Tim and I and the family, and Tim came up with this brilliant quote. And then Tess, Tim's daughter, gets told off by Dad because I've put this on Facebook, and nobody'd be interested in that. Nobody'd be interested in what I've got to say. And, God forbid you'd be sort of shooting a line. So it's very interesting about the psychology of all this and getting these things recorded. But I think Harry's particularly good because Auxiliary Air Force, and talking about the North East and 607 Squadron, which was pretty roughly handled down in the south, and just brilliant. And I'll just leave you with one last thing that he wrote about. If I can find it, I've shut the book now. The first thing that got us into contact was I'd written to Francis Blackadder, his flight commander, about Pilot Officer Franciszek Surma, a Polish pilot who flew with 607 Squadron in the Battle of Britain, and whose Spitfire crashed in 1941 near Malvern, near where I was living and working at the time. And it was really that incident that started off my journey as a very serious researcher and historian of the period, and contacting people because we were trying to reconstruct Surma's life and the whole story. So that led me to Francis Blackadder, and Harry had been to stay with him, and he showed him my letters, and then Harry wrote to me, and he said that he got this recollection of Surma, this story. And this is it. We had a very intrepid and garrulous fighter pilot in Flight Lieutenant Jim Basin's flight called Chatty, who seemed to have continued success in combat. One of our Polish pilots, called Frankie, envied Chatty's success and wished he could borrow his luck. Chatty was known to carry a toy stuffed elephant as his mascot, and Frankie pleaded and cajoled Chatty into lending it to him for a sortie in which Chatty wasn't flying. After much argument and some pushing from other members of the flight, it was agreed, providing the mascot was returned to Chatty's machine for his sortie. Anyhow, Frankie came back jubilant as he had a probable to his name, and as promised he returned the mascot to the flight rigger, who stored it in the cockpit as he had been told. Next trip Chatty was on, he missed the mascot and cursed Frankie, who said he'd returned it. Later, Chatty was shot down, and it was surmised that his change of luck was through lending the elephant. The twist of the story was that the mascot was in the aircraft all the time, but had dropped down, jamming the controls, and was found in that position when the aircraft was salvaged. Well, that's not really quite right, and again, it's another example of how the memory can cloud the actual issue over time. Chatty was Flight Lieutenant Charles Earl Bowen, a pre-war short service commission officer who'd fought in France with 607 Squadron. And on 26th of September 1940, KG-55's Heinkel's attacked the Supermarine Works at Woolston and more or less destroyed it. And 607 Squadron were one of the few squadrons that managed to get off the ground and intercept that raid that was perfectly executed, to be fair. But Surma claimed a 109 probable off the Needles that afternoon, and Bowen was scrambled afterwards and was shot down and bailed out over the Isle of Wight, and his Hurricane crashed on the island. Now actually, yeah, this is right now. Surma was scrambled he's crashed. Bowen was scrambled at 15:05 hours, shot down at 16:20. If these times are right, which I've got to tell you, folks, these official records aren't always. But Surma was scrambled at 1600 hours, destroyed an ME-109 off the Needles at 1610. So the pair couldn't have met on the ground, as Harry described, if the records are correct. So the exact facts of the tale may well have become blurred over time, but there'd undoubtedly be some truth in it. Sadly, it wasn't possible to check the facts with Flight Lieutenant Chatty Bowen, because he was sadly reported missing on the 1st of October 1940 over the Solent, and Pilot Officer Surma, in fact, when a flying officer serving with 308 Squadron at Northolt, No. 1 Polish Fighter Wing, was shot down off Dunkirk and was also reported missing. But little things like that detail you're not going to get from the official records. That is only what you're going to get from memory. And yes, the memory can be befuddled, but very often the facts can be checked out, and they're not necessarily going to tie in exactly with the story, but you can see how things have changed over time. So big thank you to the late Harry Welford for taking the time and trouble to scribe all his memoirs. There's a lot more actually in Letters from the Few about his time with 607 Squadron, particularly at summer camps and things before the war, and it's all important stuff to record. So I hope you found that interesting. We've got lots more to come. If you enjoy what we do, enjoy our videos, enjoy our podcast, please subscribe to the channel. It's all free. And please give us some feedback, good or bad. Let me know what you'd like to hear about in the comments section below. And if I can, I'll accommodate that. So thanks very much, and have a good day, whatever you're doing.